Hello and welcome back to Our Nation This Week. My name is Fatine Grozeski, your host here at the News Forum Online. Right now I have James Kitchen with me. He is a lawyer and a researcher, a litigator, a researcher with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And recently they've been tracking Bill 10 in Alberta. They've been looking into Bill 11 in New Brunswick, also flagged an article from the Saskatchewan Herald on May the 9th, all surrounding the issue of mandatory vaccinations and the potential of the state in different regions of our nation apprehending children for forced vaccination. So, James, obviously this is a huge, very controversial topic to Canadians right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Talk to us. What's happening there with Bill 10 in Alberta?
So within a span of 48 hours at the end of March and early April, the UCP government in Alberta passed a bill that amended the Public Health Act, and it gave even more sweeping powers to individual ministers of the Alberta government to repeal laws, to make new laws, to create new offenses, to change current laws, to essentially legislate on their own, which normally cabinet ministers can't do. That's the role of the legislature. And that power is concerning because one person can just, if they think it's in the public interest, according to themselves, they can write a new law. And that new law could include all kinds of very draconian things that infringe all kinds of charter freedoms. And in fact, we've already seen that used because he passed, one of the ministers here passed an order for police to be able to access COVID-19 status of individuals in Alberta. And that sort of stuff is concerning.
Okay. So the actual bill doesn't create mandatory vaccinations, but what it does is it creates a context where basically the government can produce legislation at whim and enforce some of these types of measures. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's in addition to powers already contained in the Public Health Act, in Alberta at least, and I think it's replicated in many other provinces, that discuss the ability of public health officers to order the vaccination of individuals.
Okay. Now, there is raging debate about this whole thing, and there has been even pre-COVID-19 pandemic about vaccinations. Obviously, we've got parents, an entire movement of parents internationally that are saying, listen, my children have been damaged by vaccinations, whether it's they feel that autism was triggered or some other ailment. And then you have people saying, listen, this is for the public good. And if you don't get your kids vaccinated, you're actually dangerous to society. From what I understand, what the JCCF is, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, is really flagging is that this isn't necessarily about whether vaccinations are right or wrong, but whether or not a parent should have the freedom to exercise their conscience in the matter. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The issue here, it's an individual liberty issue, right? In a free society, people are able to decide for themselves what they do with their bodies, what they put into their bodies, what they don't, how they raise their children, the beliefs that they transmit down to their children. These sorts of things are fundamental to a society remaining free and democratic. And so naturally, there's a lot of debate and disagreement on all kinds of things. And it's not just health. I mean, we see it with climate and social policy. We see it all over the place, right? The essence of freedom is the accommodation of all these different and sometimes contrarian beliefs and views and ways of living. And as long as those things are peaceful, they can be accommodated in a free democratic society, and they ought to be. So this, what really comes down to is people should not be able to control other people, whether through their own power or through the government power, to make them do what they think is right, whether or not they're right. It's regardless. This is a separate issue from whether or not vaccines truly are safe and effective, whether they are or are not. No one has a monopoly on truth, and they cannot impose what they think is true on others who don't think is true.
Okay. So in light of what you just shared there, let's talk about Bill 10 Bill 11, in New Brunswick, because they are planning on invoking the notwithstanding clause, which would basically eliminate any opportunity that Canadians would have to challenge the legislation and mandatory vaccination of children who are in the public school system or want to have access to public services. Why is that problematic in your viewpoint?
Normally, when the notwithstanding clause is invoked, it's in response to a piece of government legislation that has been struck down by the courts. And then the government will enact that same legislation. They'll invoke the notwithstanding clause, which in and of itself is obviously very problematic. That's not good for democracy. It's not good for individual liberty. In this case, there is no legislation that has been struck down in New Brunswick that mandates vaccines. So the court hasn't had a chance to rule on this, and now the court won't get a chance to rule on this if this legislation is passed, because the notwithstanding clause shields legislation from court review insofar as that legislation would violate charter rights. And there's good arguments that this bill will violate religious freedom as protected in the charter, and Section 7 of the Charter, which protects the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, which also encompasses parental rights. And so the citizens of New Brunswick won't get to have their day in court to challenge that legislation because the government has preemptively invoked the notwithstanding clause.
Wow. Wow. I think some Canadians, and particularly those from New Brunswick, might find that a little bit concerning. I want to actually pivot to another area of the nation. We talked about Alberta. We've talked about New Brunswick. Let's talk about Saskatchewan, because the JCCF, you guys posted an article on Facebook that was actually a repost of the Saskatchewan Herald publication, an article on May the 9th. I actually want to read a few excerpts about it, because basically it's talking about, again, this topic of mandatory vaccinations, suggesting that if certain measures are put in place, that those who fail, I'm reading this right from the article right now, James, that those who fail to have their children vaccinate, the state those who fail to have their children vaccinated, the state may have a simpler solution in declaring that those children require protective services until such time as they are vaccinated. Now, that's code language for we're taking your kids, from what I understand. It goes on to talk about other things that might be withheld, passports, pensions, CCB. And then this statement right here in the article talks about conservatives, that it specifically flags conservatives who are susceptible to misinformation and lack grounding in fact-based science. This is an alarmingly judgmental statement, to basically assume that anyone who has a conservative perspective is uneducated and lacking fact-based science grounding. James, help on this one. What do we do with statements like that in a major publication?
Well, these are the words of a self-righteous tyrant. And we unfortunately seem to have a lot of those in our society right now. We've seen that the last few months, and that's unfortunate. And it needs to be refuted. That the people need to. Sometimes that stuff should be ignored, and sometimes it should be responded to with thoughtful arguments. And I don't just mean arguments about the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Those arguments need to be had. There's a valid argument to be had there. But in addition to that, as I said earlier, this is a liberty issue. The person who wrote this fundamentally rejects the notion of individual liberty, fundamentally rejects the notion of a free society that accommodates different modes of living. And that's serious. That needs to be pointed out, right? Because people need to decide in Canada if that's what they want. Do they want a nation where the state controls everything, takes your kids at whim, does whatever they want to them? I mean, this is serious, right? Bodily autonomy is serious. And the interesting thing is bodily autonomy is not, that's important to both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, obviously this was a leftist who wrote this. Bodily autonomy and integrity has been a huge notion on the left for decades. I mean, this goes back to the my body, my choice abortion issue, right? It's ironic how that only seems to apply in that context, but they're not willing to grant that to people who oppose vaccines. So it's very concerning. I've heard that rhetoric before. We hear the rhetoric from political leaders of the lockdown isn't going to fully end until we have a vaccine. That's concerning rhetoric, right? It should be about choice. You want to get a vaccine? You want to wear a mask? Go for it, right? That's choice. But if you don't, the state should not be forcing you. And that's why we have these rights. That's why we have constitutional rights, is to protect against that choice being taken away without really good reasons. And I don't think those reasons are there to have to against somebody's will, without their consent, to inject something into their body. That's egregious.
Well, we sure appreciate JCCF and your willingness to flag this article from the Saskatchewan Herald and some of the other things we've talked about today. Okay, let's land this with a little bit of hope here. What can people actually do if people have concerns about their liberties, about their freedoms, about their parental rights? You know, I also just want to say that in this article, I also talked about forced vaccination of the elderly. So we might be talking about our parents, grandparents as well, not just our children, ourselves. And so what would you suggest to people who have concern about this? What would you suggest that they do?
Well, two things, and it comes down to putting their money where their mouth is, both with their money and with their time and their energy and their actions and their words. Donate to those who are representing your causes, whether through legal advocacy or just normal advocacy, and obviously that would include the Justice Center. If somebody supports what the Justice Center is doing, we're a nonprofit charity. All of our revenue comes from donations. If you support what we do, if you like our advocacy, if you think it's needed, donate. But I would also encourage people to speak out, to write letters, to contact their MLAs, to contact their MPs, to discuss it with their friends, to raise the issue with their organizations and their colleagues and their groups. That matters. Right? Speaking up matters. I mean, that's how things get changed. That's how history's gotten changed, because people have decided to take the risk to say something that they believe is right, even if it's unpopular. Right? You'd be surprised how many people have valid criticisms of a lot of mainstream things, such as vaccines, and they're not kooks. They're people who've thought about the issues, and they have reasoned things to say, and they ought to be listened to. And we need more of those people to take the risk to speak up, because there is a risk. There's a risk when you express unpopular opinions. But if you don't take that risk, things don't change. And so that's what I would encourage people to do, is to take action with their wallet and with their mouths.
Wonderful. Well, that's great advice. And once again, we sure appreciate the good work of JCCF. And I want to, I guess, close by saying this. I believe that, most Canadians across the board are reasonable people. They are open to intellectual, open-hearted, compassionate-based, intellectually based debates, even when we disagree. And if we can't have, conversations about issues, whether it's mandatory vaccination, whether it's a life issue, like you mentioned, there's so many others, then we've lost a real essential part of our democracy. So I sure appreciate you joining with me today, James, and we hope to have you back. This is Faytine Grzeski, Our Nation This Week with the News Forum.